December 8, 1963. Quinn Yates crossed the cold factory floor, the soles of his work boots squeaking across the polished concrete. He moved with the practiced rhythm of a man who knew his place in the world, each step measured, deliberate, confident. 22 years at Studebaker had molded his gait to match the steady tempo of the assembly line. Even on Sundays, even in church, his feet kept the factory's time. The Plant 2 assembly building stretched before him like a vast steel cathedral, its high windows gathering what little December sunlight South Bend had to offer. Quinn breathed in the familiar scents. Machine oil, hot metal, the ghost of cigarette smoke, the lingering tang of yesterday's welding. "Morning, Quinn," called Hank from the electrical station. "Ready for Christmas bonus talk." Quinn nodded, raising his thermos in greeting. Christmas bonuses at Studebaker had become as reliable as the seasons. Even in lean years, the company had always made good. That was the unspoken covenant between a man and the company that defined him. You gave your years, they gave you security. "Hoping for enough to get Nancy that singer she's been eyeing," Quinn said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The tiny tailor just ain't cutting it anymore." "Better be a damn good bonus this year," Hank said, his voice dropping. "Heard Peterson's crew got sent home early Friday. Line 6 shut down completely." Something cold settled in Quinn's stomach, but he dismissed it with practiced ease. Temporary slowdowns happened. 22 years had taught him that production ebbed and flowed like the St. Joseph River, sometimes rushing, sometimes trickling, but always flowing, always there. "Just seasonal," Quinn said with the certainty of a man who had weathered every industrial storm. "They'll be back after New Year's." At 43, Quinn carried himself like the foundation of South Bend itself. His shoulders, broad and square beneath his blue work shirt, bore the invisible weight of mortgage payments, his daughter's college plans, and the quiet pride of being a Studebaker man in a Studebaker town. His hands, square, callous things with thick fingers, had helped build cars that rolled on every American highway. Those same hands had signed for his house on Sunnymead Avenue, had built the backyard swing set, had carried his daughter Naomi on his shoulders at Studebaker Company picnics. The morning shift whistle cut through his thoughts, its familiar wail both comforting and commanding. The mechanical pulse of the factory began to quicken around him as workers found their stations. Quinn moved toward the dashboard assembly area, where he'd spent the last 14 years perfecting the installation of gauges, dials, and controls for Larks, Hawks, and now the sleek new Aventis. But as he approached his station, Quinn noticed something odd. The parts bins, normally stacked high with dashboard components, were half empty. No fresh delivery waited in the staging area. The conveyor belt that fed his station hummed but moved nothing. Foreman Leonard Turner appeared, clipboard in hand, his usual ruddy face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Meeting in 10 minutes, he announced, voice tight. "Everyone in Building 2, floor managers, line supervisors, all shifts." "What's going on, Len?" Quinn asked, the rhythm of his morning suddenly, uncomfortably disrupted. Turner looked down at his clipboard, then back up, avoiding Quinn's eyes. "Just be at the meeting, Yates." Quinn glanced around. Other workers were noticing the same things he had, the missing parts, the unusual stillness in certain sections of the floor. Whispers rippled through the massive building. "I heard the board met yesterday," said Vic Donahue, sliding up beside Quinn. At 59, Vic had been at Studebaker longer than almost anyone. Saturday meeting, never a good sign. "Just budget stuff," Quinn said, though the coldness in his stomach had grown. "End-of-year numbers." Vic's weathered face creased into a frown. "My cousin's brother-in-law works security. Said the executives were taking papers out in boxes, whole damn offices." "Rumor mill's always running faster than the assembly line," Quinn said with forced lightness. But his eyes tracked Turner as the foreman moved through the building, face grim, clipboard clutched like a shield. At the meeting, Quinn stood with 300 other men, shoulder to shoulder in the center of Building 2. The massive space, usually alive with the sounds of manufacturing, was eerily quiet. Only the shuffle of work boots and the occasional cough punctuated the silence. Plant manager Harold Wilson stood on a raised platform, flanked by 2 men in suits Quinn didn't recognize. Wilson's face was ashen, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded a single sheet of paper. "As of 12:01 this morning, Wilson began, his voice echoing through the silent factory, the Studebaker Corporation has ceased all automotive manufacturing operations in South Bend, Indiana. The words hit Quinn like a physical blow. Around him, men went still, as if collectively holding their breath. Limited production will continue at the Hamilton, Ontario plant, Wilson continued, reading mechanically from his paper. All South Bend automotive operations are terminated, effective immediately. A low murmur rose from the assembled workers, disbelief giving way to confusion, then to the first sparks of anger. "This is bullshit," someone shouted from the back. "What about notice? What about our contracts?" Wilson raised a hand, but the tremor was more pronounced now. "Severance details will be provided. 2 weeks' pay for every year of service, up to 20 years. The math hit Quinn instantly, 20 years capped. He'd given Studebaker 22 years of his life, but those last 2 years, worth nearly a month's wages, had just vanished, erased with a corporate pen stroke. "Your final paychecks and severance will be mailed," Wilson continued, his voice nearly drowned out now by the growing roar of angry voices. "Please collect your personal belongings and exit the building in an orderly fashion." "That's it," Vic shouted beside Quinn. 27 years and that's it." Quinn stood motionless as chaos erupted around him. Some men surged forward toward the platform, others turned and stalked out, cursing. Still others simply stood, stunned, as if their feet had become part of the concrete floor. 7,000 jobs gone just like that. The Studebaker Corporation had been South Bend's industrial heart since 1852. The company had evolved from wagon making to automobiles, becoming the backbone of the city's economy. Every family in South Bend was connected to Studebaker somehow. If you didn't work there yourself, your father did, or your brother, your uncle, your neighbor. And now, without warning, it was over. Quinn felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Vic, eyes red-rimmed but dry. "You all right, Quinn?" Vic asked, though the question seemed absurd. None of them were all right. "They can't just," Quinn started, then stopped. Of course they could, and they had. He moved through the rest of the morning in a fog. He retrieved his lunch pail and thermos from his locker, nodded numbly to shell-shocked coworkers, and somehow found himself outside in the parking lot, the December air bitingly cold against his face. The factory that had structured his days since he was 21 years old now loomed behind him, still standing but suddenly alien. Its familiar bulk, once a symbol of permanence, of American industrial might, now seemed hollow, a shell about to be abandoned. Quinn climbed into his '59 Lark, the car he'd helped build, purchased with his employee discount. He sat behind the wheel, key in hand, but didn't start the engine. Beyond the windshield, men streamed out of the factory doors, some alone, some in tight clusters, their breath fogging in the winter air. 8 days before Christmas, and 7,000 men suddenly had no jobs. The drive home to Sunnymead Avenue took Quinn through downtown South Bend. He passed storefronts decorated for Christmas, windows painted with snowy scenes and twinkling lights strung across Michigan Street. The city looked oblivious, unaware that its economic foundation had just crumbled. His hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force. His mind circled relentlessly around impossible questions. How would he tell Nancy? What about the mortgage, Naomi's college fund? How long would the severance last? Who would hire a 43-year-old assembly worker in a city whose main employer had just vanished? The Lark's tires crunched on the gravel of his driveway, and Quinn cut the engine. He sat for a long moment, staring at the modest 2-story house he'd been so proud to purchase 8 years ago. The tidy yard, the fresh paint from last summer, the basketball hoop he'd installed over the garage. All of it suddenly seemed precarious, as if the house itself might disappear as quickly as his job had. Nancy Yates was hanging Christmas garland along the staircase when she heard Quinn's key in the lock. She frowned, checking the clock on the mantel. 11:17 a.m. Quinn had never come home for lunch in 22 years at Studebaker. She set down the garland and moved toward the entryway, a question forming on her lips. The question died when she saw his face. "Quinn, what's happened?" He stood in the doorway, still wearing his work jacket, his lunch pail dangling from his hand as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. "They closed it," he said, his voice flat. "Studebaker's gone." Nancy's hand went to her throat, her fingers finding the small gold locket Quinn had given her for their 15th anniversary, paid for with a Studebaker Christmas bonus. "What do you mean gone?" she asked, though something in her already understood. "Shut down, this morning, no warning." Quinn moved past her into the living room, set his lunch pail on the coffee table with mechanical precision. 7,000 jobs just gone. Nancy followed him, her mind racing. But they can't just without notice. What about contracts, the union? Quinn gave a laugh that held no humor. Turns out they can do whatever they want. Nancy sat beside him on the sofa, processing. Like most company wives, she'd absorbed Studebaker's rhythms into her bones. The plant whistle at shift change was audible across South Bend on still days. She planned meals around Quinn's shifts, knew which weeks of the month he'd be tired from overtime, which seasons brought layoff scares and which brought bonus talk. "What are we going to do?" she asked finally, her hand finding his. "I don't know," Quinn admitted, and the words seemed to cost him physically. In 23 years of marriage, Nancy had rarely heard those words from him. Quinn Yates had always known exactly what to do: work hard, stay loyal, provide. "Maybe the plant in Canada," she suggested. "You could transfer." Quinn shook his head. "Limited operations. They're keeping maybe 500 workers, and they'll be Canadian." They sat in silence, the half-decorated Christmas tree in the corner suddenly garish in its cheerfulness. Through the living room window, Quinn could see their neighbor Gil Harvey's Studebaker hawk in the driveway across the street. Gil worked in accounting at the plant. Was he home too? Were all 7,000 of them sitting in living rooms across South Bend right now, having this same conversation? "We have savings," Nancy said finally, squeezing his hand. "And your severance, how much?" 2 weeks for every year, capped at 20 years, Quinn recited. 40 weeks' pay. "That's nearly a year," Nancy calculated, relief in her voice. "Plenty of time to find something else." Quinn didn't answer. In his mind, he was seeing South Bend as it would be next week, next month, 7,000 men all looking for work in the same small city. 7,000 families cutting back on groceries, on Christmas presents, on car repairs and new clothes and dinner out. 7,000 men competing for what jobs? The smaller parts suppliers who depended on Studebaker would close next, the restaurants where workers ate lunch, the shops where their wives bought clothes. The whole economy of South Bend had just taken a bullet to the heart, and the bleeding was only beginning. "I'll call First Federal tomorrow," Nancy was saying, her practical nature already sorting through their options. "See about the mortgage, maybe they can defer payments until—" "I should have seen it coming," Quinn interrupted, his voice hollow. "There were signs." Nancy frowned. "What signs?" "Production cuts, parts shortages. The way they rushed the 64 models." Quinn ran a hand over his face. "I just thought, it's Studebaker, they've been here since before the Civil War, they built wagons for the Union Army, for Christ's sake, they survived the Depression. How could they just end?" Nancy had no answer for that. She squeezed his hand again, then rose. "I'll make some coffee. Naomi will be home from school in a few hours. We should decide how to tell her." Naomi. Their daughter, 17 and bright, a senior at James Whitcomb Riley High School. She'd been accepted early decision to Indiana University for next fall. The tuition deposit was due in February. Quinn closed his eyes, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. "We'll figure it out," Nancy said, mistaking his silence for doubt. "We always do." Quinn nodded, but the certainty that had defined his life had fractured. Since he was old enough to understand what it meant to be a man in South Bend, Indiana, he'd known the formula: work hard, stay loyal to the company. The company takes care of you. His father had worked at Studebaker for 34 years. His grandfather had built wagons there in the century's first decade. 3 generations of Yates men had shaped their lives around the company's needs, had measured their worth by their ability to maintain that sacred contract between worker and employer. And now the contract was broken. When the phone rang, it startled both of them. Nancy hurried to answer it, and Quinn heard her voice, low and serious, in the kitchen. She returned moments later, her face grim. "That was Patty Donahue," she said. "Vic is at Memorial Hospital. Heart attack right there in the parking lot after the announcement." Quinn felt the blood drain from his face. "Is he?" Nancy shook her head. "They don't know yet. Patty's at the hospital now." Quinn rose, reaching for his car keys. "I should go." I'll come with you, Nancy said, already reaching for her coat. The waiting room at Memorial Hospital was crowded with Studebaker men and their wives, some still in work clothes, many with the same shell-shocked expression Quinn had seen in the factory parking lot. Vic's wife Patty sat surrounded by a protective circle of women, while knots of men stood in corners, voices low, expressions grim. 5 heart attacks so far, reported Hank from electrical, materializing at Quinn's elbow. Vic, 2 guys from body assembly, 1 from paint, and old Peterson from quality control. Quinn stared at him. Peterson, he's only 52. 51, Hank corrected. Found out this morning his pension's gone. 29 years at Studebaker and the pension fund's gone, just like that. What do you mean gone? Nancy asked, her voice sharp with alarm. Quinn's pension was still decades away, but they'd counted on it as surely as they counted on the sun rising. Hank lowered his voice. Company's been underfunding it for years. There's talk the whole pension system might collapse with the South Bend operations. Quinn felt a wave of nausea. The pension had been the ultimate promise, the company's pledge that a lifetime of loyalty would be rewarded with security in old age. They can't just, Nancy began but stopped herself. They were all learning what companies could just do. A doctor emerged from the double doors and the room went silent. He conferred quietly with Patty, whose hand flew to her mouth. The circle of women closed around her immediately. Vic, Quinn asked Hank. Hank shook his head. Gone, massive coronary. Quinn's knees nearly buckled. Vic Donohue, with his booming laugh and endless supply of off-color jokes. Vic, who'd shown Quinn the ropes when he started at Studebaker. Vic, who should have been retiring in 3 years with a gold watch and a pension that would let him and Patty move to Florida. Gone, just like the factory. Just like the jobs, just like the certainties that had structured their lives. The hospital waiting room became an impromptu wake, not just for Vic but for Studebaker itself. Men who had spent decades working side by side now faced a future without the daily ritual that had defined their identities. They exchanged phone numbers, promises to check in, half-hearted assurances that everything would work out. Oliver Tractor is hiring, someone offered. Not many spots, but they're taking applications. Bendix might have some openings in the spring, said another. My cousin's in management there. But everyone knew the reality. South Bend couldn't absorb 7,000 unemployed men, not all at once. Not with the city's entire economic ecosystem dependent on the very company that had just pulled the rug out from under them. As they drove home, Quinn stared out at South Bend with new eyes. The city he'd known his entire life, the city built by and for Studebaker, suddenly seemed fragile, temporary. How many of these small businesses would survive once the severance checks ran out and 7,000 families cut their spending to the bone? How many families would leave, seeking work elsewhere? How many homes would go into foreclosure when mortgage payments couldn't be met? We should go to the bank tomorrow, Nancy said, breaking into his thoughts. See how long we can stretch the savings if we're careful. Quinn nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about his father, Arthur Yates, who'd retired from Studebaker 7 years ago with a pension that was now in jeopardy. About his daughter Naomi, whose college dreams might have to be deferred. About the Christmas presents already wrapped and hidden in the attic, purchased with money that now needed to stretch much further than they'd planned. When they pulled into their driveway, Naomi's school bus was just stopping at the corner. Quinn watched his daughter step off, her red coat bright against the gray December afternoon, her book bag slung over one shoulder. She spotted their car and waved, her face lighting up with the simple joy of seeing her parents home early. Quinn felt his throat tighten. How do you tell your child that the future you've promised her is suddenly uncertain? Dad, Naomi called, hurrying up the driveway. Why are you home? Is something wrong? Quinn exchanged a glance with Nancy, then forced a smile. Let's go inside, honey, we need to talk. The next days passed in a blur of awful practicality. Quinn and Nancy sat at the kitchen table with their bank book, calculating how many months they could pay the mortgage if Quinn couldn't find work. They called Beneficial Finance about the car loan, Indiana University about deferring Naomi's tuition deposit, the life insurance company about borrowing against Quinn's policy. Each night, Quinn lay awake beside Nancy, listening to the wind rattle the windows of the house he now feared losing. Each morning, he rose with no job to go to, no factory whistle to structure his day. The severance checks arrived 4 days before Christmas, sooner than expected, but with an unwelcome surprise. The amount was calculated on base pay only, not including the overtime that had supplemented Quinn's income for years. It was less than they'd counted on, another broken promise to add to the tally. Quinn cashed the check and withdrew their savings, then divided the cash into envelopes: mortgage, utilities, groceries, Naomi's college fund, emergency reserve. The physical act of parceling out their future into paper packets made the precariousness of their situation viscerally real. On December 20th, Quinn drove downtown to check the job boards and fill out applications. South Michigan Street was eerily quiet for the holiday season. Many storefronts already sported "REDUCEDHOURS" signs. The lunch counter at Robertson's department store, usually packed with shoppers, was half empty. At the Indiana Employment Security Division office, Quinn found a line stretching out the door and down the block, all men in work clothes, breath fogging in the cold air, faces set in the same determined mask. He recognized most of them: assembly line workers, foremen, engineers, men who had built cars together just 2 weeks earlier, now competing for the same scarce jobs. Quinn took his place at the end of the line, nodding to familiar faces. No one spoke much. What was there to say? They had all believed the same thing: that loyalty would be rewarded, that Studebaker would provide, that the company and the city were permanent fixtures in a reliable world. When he finally reached the front of the line, Quinn was handed a form to fill out. The woman behind the counter had the haggard look of someone working impossible hours. "Skills?" she asked, not looking up from her paperwork. Quinn hesitated. What were his skills exactly? He knew every step of dashboard assembly for Studebaker models dating back to 1949. He could spot a misaligned gauge from 3 feet away. He knew exactly how many inch-pounds of torque to apply to each fastening, none of which mattered now. "Assembly," he said finally. "Quality control, some supervision." The woman nodded, still not making eye contact. "Manufacturing experience. I'll put you on the list for Oliver, Bendix, and South Bend Lathe. But I should tell you, we've got over 4,000 applications for maybe 200 openings. Come back after New Year's to check the board." Quinn took the carbon copy she handed him and stepped aside for the next man in line. Outside, the temperature had dropped and a few snowflakes swirled in the air. Across the street, a Salvation Army bellringer stood beside his red kettle, his cheerful greeting at odds with the somber mood of the men filing out of the employment office. Quinn dropped a quarter in the kettle, less than he would have given 2 weeks ago, but giving nothing felt like surrendering to despair. He walked the downtown streets, noting how many businesses displayed Studebaker vehicles in their company fleets. The telephone company, the gas utility, the city itself, all had relied on the steep fleet discounts Studebaker had offered. How many of those contracts were now in jeopardy? How many more dominoes would fall? At the South Bend Tribune building, a crowd had gathered around the bulletin board where the day's headlines were posted. Quinn edged closer to read: "Studebaker shut down ROCKS City. 7,000 jobs lost, economic impact expected to be severe. Pension fund faces uncertainty." A man next to Quinn spat on the sidewalk. "Pension fund faces uncertainty. That's a nice way of saying they stole our retirement." Quinn said nothing. He'd been contributing to that pension fund since his first day at Studebaker, secure in the knowledge that it would provide for him and Nancy in their old age. Now that security, like so much else, had evaporated. He continued down Michigan Street, stopping at each business with a "Help Wanted" sign, no matter how meager the offering. A service station needed a night attendant. Quinn filled out an application. A janitorial service was hiring. Quinn put his name on their list. A restaurant sought a dishwasher for the evening shift. Quinn asked for a form. By mid-afternoon, he had applied for 7 jobs, none of which would come close to replacing his Studebaker wages, none of which utilized his decades of manufacturing experience, all of which had dozens of other applicants. As he walked back to his car, Quinn passed the grand showroom of Newman and Altman, South Bend's largest Studebaker dealership. The gleaming new 64 models still sat on the showroom floor, their sleek lines and chrome accents catching the winter sunlight. A large banner proclaimed, The new 64 Studebakers, the best ever. Quinn stood on the sidewalk, staring at the cars he had helped build, cars that now had no factory to supply parts for them. Cars whose resale value had plummeted overnight, cars that represented the last gasp of a company that had defined his city for over a century. Inside the showroom, he could see salesmen in their suits, gesturing with forced enthusiasm to the few customers browsing. Their jobs would be the next to go once the remaining inventory sold out. Then the parts department employees, then the service technicians. The ripple effects would continue for months, for years. Quinn turned away from the showroom and continued to his car. He had one more stop to make before heading home. St. Joseph Cemetery sprawled across 30 acres on the south side of town, its rolling hills dotted with monuments and markers dating back to South Bend's founding. Quinn parked along the narrow cemetery road and made his way through rows of headstones until he reached the simple granite marker that read, Arthur James Yates, 1898–1960. Beloved husband and father. Quinn's father had died of a stroke 3 years earlier, after 34 years at Studebaker. He'd been one of the lucky ones. He'd received his gold watch, his full pension, his retirement party at the company recreation hall. He'd died believing in the permanence of the world he'd helped build. They're gone, Dad, Quinn said quietly, brushing snow from the top of the headstone. Studebaker's gone. Saying the words aloud to his father's grave made them real in a way they hadn't been before. Quinn felt something break loose inside him, not quite grief, not quite anger, but a complicated mixture of both, laced with betrayal. You always said, be loyal to the company and the company will be loyal to you, Quinn continued, his voice rough. You believed that, I believed it too. The cemetery was silent except for the distant sound of traffic on Miami Street. Quinn stood with his bare hand on the cold granite, feeling a connection to his father that transcended death, both of them Studebaker men, though the meaning of that identity had fundamentally changed. I don't know what happens now, Quinn admitted. I don't know how to be anything else. By the time Quinn returned home, dusk was settling over South Bend. Christmas lights twinkled on houses up and down Sunnymead Avenue, including his own. Nancy had put them up the week before, maintaining normal routines in the face of upheaval. Naomi's boyfriend's car, a '58 Ford his father had helped him fix up, sat in the driveway. Quinn parked behind it and sat for a moment, composing himself. His daughter had enough to worry about without seeing the weight of uncertainty on his face. Inside, he found Naomi and her boyfriend Tyler at the kitchen table with college brochures spread between them. Tyler jumped to his feet when Quinn entered, extending his hand with the nervous formality of a young man still eager to impress his girlfriend's father. Mr. Yates, he said, I was just showing Naomi the Ball State catalog. My dad says their business program is really good, and the tuition's a lot less than IU. Quinn shook the boy's hand, noting the calluses that spoke of a teenager who already worked with his hands. Tyler's father was a mechanic at Pep Boys, one of the few automotive businesses in South Bend not directly tied to Studebaker's fate. Ball State's a good school, Quinn agreed, hanging up his coat. Naomi looked up from the brochure, her expression carefully neutral. They have journalism too, not as good as IU's program but decent, and Tyler says we could both commute from Muncie if we got an apartment together. Quinn kept his face equally neutral, though the thought of his 17-year-old daughter living with her boyfriend sent a jolt of parental alarm through him. But these were not normal times, and practical considerations had to outweigh traditional ones. We can talk about it, he said, moving to the refrigerator to hide the emotion on his face. Where's your mom? Robertson's, Naomi replied. They're having a sale. She said we needed a few things for Christmas dinner. Quinn nodded, though he knew the real reason Nancy had gone shopping, to return the gifts they could no longer afford. They'd agreed to scale back Christmas dramatically, keeping only the most meaningful presents, returning the rest for refunds they desperately needed. Any luck today, Dad? Naomi asked, her voice careful, as if she feared the answer. Quinn turned from the refrigerator with a forced smile. Put in applications at 7 places. Something will turn up. Naomi's face brightened with the resilient optimism of youth. See, I told you, everyone knows Studebaker men are the best workers in Indiana. They'll be fighting over you. Tyler nodded earnestly. My dad says the same thing. He'd hire you at Pep Boys in a heartbeat if they had an opening. Quinn thanked them both, touched by their faith and unwilling to dampen it with the reality he'd seen downtown. Thousands of men with identical skills, identical work histories, identical needs, all competing for jobs that didn't exist. Later that evening, after Tyler had gone home and Naomi had retreated to her room to study, Nancy returned from her shopping expedition. She set a single Robertson's bag on the kitchen counter, her face drawn with exhaustion. I returned the cashmere sweater and the leather gloves, she reported quietly, and the record player we were going to give Naomi. She reached into the bag and withdrew a small box. I kept the charm bracelet, I just couldn't. It's her graduation gift. I've been adding charms since she was in 9th grade. Quinn pulled his wife into an embrace, feeling the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her breathing that suggested she was fighting tears. You did right, he assured her. She'll treasure that bracelet her whole life. Nancy leaned into him, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability before straightening up and wiping her eyes. I saw Helen Turner at Robertson's. She said Leonard's going to Ontario. Studebaker offered him a position at the Canadian plant. Quinn felt a stab of something like jealousy, quickly replaced by bitter understanding. Of course the company would keep Turner. As a foreman, he had skills they still needed. Assembly line workers like Quinn were expendable, interchangeable, replaceable. Good for Leonard, he said, meaning it despite the envy. Helen must be relieved. Nancy busied herself unpacking the few items she hadn't returned. She's not going with him, at least not yet. They can't sell their house, no one's buying in South Bend right now. He'll rent a room up there and send money back until they figure something out. Quinn absorbed this new reality. Families separated, marriages strained across international borders, all because a company had decided that its century-long covenant with South Bend was no longer profitable to maintain. I heard from Ruth Donohue, Nancy continued, her voice softening. Vic's funeral is Saturday at St. Matthew's. They're expecting a big turnout. Quinn nodded, his mind returning to the hospital waiting room, to Vic's wife receiving the news, to the 4 other heart attacks that same day. The human cost of Studebaker's closure was already mounting, and they were only 12 days in. I think we should go to midnight mass, Nancy said, changing the subject, on Christmas Eve. We always do, and it would be good for Naomi to see that some things aren't changing. Quinn agreed, though the thought of facing the entire parish, many of them fellow Studebaker families, all of them aware of what had happened, made his stomach clench. The pity in their eyes, the awkward conversations, the well-meaning but hollow assurances that everything would work out. We'll go, he said, helping Nancy put away the groceries she'd purchased with their newly precious dollars. Some things shouldn't change. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the furnace cycle on and off, Quinn knew that everything had already changed. The South Bend he'd known his entire life, the city built on the unshakable foundation of Studebaker's permanence, was gone. Whatever came next would be fundamentally different, a new reality they were all still struggling to comprehend. Christmas came, subdued but not joyless. The Yates family maintained as many traditions as they could afford, the tree, though with fewer presents beneath it, the turkey dinner, though with simpler side dishes, the gathering of extended family, though conversations carefully skirted around job prospects and financial concerns. Quinn's father-in-law, a retired schoolteacher with a secure pension, slipped him an envelope containing $500, nearly a month's wages at Studebaker. Quinn's pride warred with his practical need, but he accepted the gift with gratitude. Just until you're on your feet again, his father-in-law said, waving away Quinn's thanks. You'd do the same for me. Naomi received her charm bracelet with genuine delight, each charm representing a milestone in her young life. A tiny silver book for her academic achievements, a musical note for her years in choir, a graduation cap for her future college career. Quinn watched his daughter's face as she examined each charm, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe that her future would unfold as planned, despite the economic earthquake that had shaken their foundations. The new year arrived with little celebration in South Bend. January 1964 dawned cold and gray, the holiday decorations around the city coming down to reveal the stark reality beneath. For sale signs multiplying on homes, closed signs appearing on small businesses, inventory reduction banners stretching across storefronts. Quinn returned to the Employment Security Division office to check the job boards, only to find the same dispiriting scene. Long lines, few listings, growing desperation. He applied for positions at Bendix, at South Bend Lathe, at Associates Investment, at any company still hiring. He received polite rejections or, more often, no response at all. By mid-January, the first exodus began. Families with relatives in Detroit, in Cleveland, in Chicago, anywhere with automotive or manufacturing work, started packing up and leaving. Moving vans became a common sight on Sunny Med Avenue. Houses stood empty, their owners unable to sell in a market suddenly glutted with similar properties, forced to abandon their equity and start over elsewhere. "Larsons are leaving next week," Nancy reported over dinner one evening. "Bill got on at Ford in Dearborn. They're just walking away from their house, can't sell it, can't rent it, can't keep paying the mortgage from Michigan." Quinn nodded, unsurprised. The Larsons lived 3 doors down, their backyard adjoining the Yates property. Bill Larson had been at Studebaker for 16 years in the paint department. "What about the Rodriguez family?" Naomi asked. Maria Rodriguez was one of her closest friends, a fellow senior at Riley High. "Chicago," Nancy said. "Roberto's brother got him on at the steel mill. They leave after graduation." Quinn pushed food around his plate, appetite diminished by the news of more departures. He'd known these neighbors for years, had attended their children's birthday parties, had helped them re-roof their houses, had borrowed their lawnmowers and lent them his snow blower. The fabric of the community was unraveling thread by thread. "Dad," Naomi's voice broke into his thoughts, "did you hear back from Bendix?" Quinn shook his head, avoiding his daughter's eyes. "Not yet, these things take time." He didn't tell her that he'd already received rejection letters from Bendix, from Oliver Tractor, from every major manufacturer in the area. At 43, with skills specific to an industry that no longer existed in South Bend, Quinn was discovering the bitter truth of age discrimination. Companies that were hiring preferred younger workers, men in their 20s who would accept lower wages and could be trained in new skills without the habits of 2 decades at Studebaker. "Tyler's dad says Pep Boys might be hiring soon," Naomi offered, her voice bright with hope. "Assistant manager position. Tyler said he'd put in a good word for you." Quinn managed a smile. "That's good of him, I'll follow up on it." But even as he said the words, Quinn knew the reality. A position at Pep Boys would pay half what he'd earned at Studebaker, with none of the benefits, none of the security. It would be barely enough to keep the mortgage paid, with nothing left for Naomi's college fund, nothing for emergencies, nothing for the future. January bled into February and still no job materialized. Quinn's severance would last until April if they were careful, longer if they dipped into the emergency fund they'd set aside for Naomi's education. Nancy had taken on extra alterations work, sewing from home for women who could still afford to have their clothes tailored. The extra income helped, but not enough. Quinn began to look beyond South Bend, scanning job listings in Indianapolis, in Fort Wayne, in Chicago. The idea of leaving, of abandoning the community where his father had lived and died, where he and Nancy had raised their daughter, where they had planned to spend the rest of their lives, felt like a surrender. But with each passing week, it seemed less like a choice and more like an inevitability. On a frigid February morning, Quinn drove to the Studebaker administration building on Main Street, where a job fair had been hastily organized for former employees. The grand Art Deco building, once the proud headquarters of a manufacturing empire, now seemed like a mausoleum, its elegant facade at odds with the desperate scene inside. Folding tables lined the marble-floored lobby, each staffed by recruiters from companies across the Midwest. The lines for automotive plants in Michigan and Ohio stretched out the door. The lines for local businesses were shorter but moved sluggishly, each applicant spending precious minutes trying to convince recruiters that their Studebaker experience translated to banking, to retail, to insurance sales. Quinn stood in line for Torrington Company, a bearing manufacturer in South Bend that had announced 20 new positions. The man ahead of him, whom Quinn recognized from Building 3, turned and offered a cigarette. "Thanks," Quinn said, accepting both the cigarette and the light the man offered. "Any luck so far?" The man Peterson, Quinn recalled, though he wasn't sure of the first name, gave a bitter laugh. Been to 4 tables, same story each time. Great experience will keep your application on file, which means too old, too expensive, too Studebaker. Quinn drew on the cigarette, letting the smoke fill his lungs before exhaling into the already hazy air of the crowded lobby. You thinking about leaving town? Peterson nodded. My brother-in-law's in Cincinnati, says they're hiring at General Electric, aircraft engines. He flicked ash onto the marble floor, a small act of defiance in a building that had once been kept immaculate. Never thought I'd leave South Bend, born here, planned to die here. Same, Quinn admitted. Place won't be the same anyway, Peterson continued, his voice low and angry, not without Studebaker. Whole damn city was built around that company. What's South Bend without it? Just another dying town in the Rust Belt. Quinn had no answer for that. South Bend had always been Studebaker, and Studebaker had always been South Bend. The company's founders had built the city's infrastructure, had endowed its universities, had shaped its identity for over a century. What remained when that central pillar was removed? He reached the front of the line and handed his application to a tired-looking woman in a Torrington Company blazer. She glanced at it, her expression giving away nothing. Assembly experience, she noted. Quality control. Supervisory roles. Yes, ma'am, Quinn confirmed. 22 years. I know every aspect of production flow, inventory management, quality standards. We'll be in touch, she interrupted, placing his application on a stack that already looked impossibly high. Next, please. Quinn stepped aside, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. As he moved toward the exit, he passed the table for Dodge Manufacturing, where a sign had been hastily posted. No further APPLICATIONS being accepted today. Outside, the temperature had dropped further and a bitter wind whipped down Main Street. Quinn turned up the collar of his coat and walked the 6 blocks to where he'd parked, saving the dime it would have cost to park closer. Such calculations had become second nature now, every penny saved, every expense questioned, every indulgence denied. As he walked, Quinn passed Newman and Altman's showroom again. The gleaming 64 Studebakers still sat in the window, but now they were surrounded by clearance signs. Final inventory, PRICES/ everything must go. The sight hit Quinn with unexpected force. Even knowing that Studebaker was gone, seeing the physical evidence of its liquidation, the cars he had helped build now being sold off like damaged goods, made the loss newly painful. He continued past First Bank of South Bend, where a discreet sign in the window announced, "Mortgage assistance available for former Studebaker employees." The bank, like every business in South Bend, was feeling the effects of the closure. Foreclosures were bad for everyone, better to work out payment plans, to extend terms, to keep families in their homes if possible. Quinn and Nancy had already met with their loan officer, a sympathetic young man who had extended their mortgage by 10 years, lowering the monthly payment to a level they might be able to maintain on a significantly reduced income. The trade-off was obvious: 10 more years of debt, 10 fewer years to build retirement savings, 10 years added to a financial burden that should have been lightening as they entered their 50s. At home, Quinn found Nancy at the dining room table, surrounded by papers. She looked up when he entered, her expression telling him everything he needed to know about the job fair. Nothing, she asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. Quinn shook his head, hanging his coat on the rack by the door. What's all this? Nancy gestured to the papers spread before her. I've been running the numbers. If we sell the house now, we might still get enough to cover the mortgage. We could rent something smaller, put the difference toward Naomi's tuition. Quinn stared at the neat columns of figures his wife had calculated, each one representing a piece of their carefully constructed life being dismantled. Sell the house, he repeated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Nancy reached for his hand. Quinn, we have to face reality. Your severance runs out in 8 weeks. Even with my alterations work, we can't keep up the payments much longer, and Naomi's tuition deposit is due next month. Quinn sank into a chair beside her, studying the calculations she'd made. Nancy had always managed their household finances, her practical nature perfectly suited to the task. If she said they needed to sell, then they needed to sell. Where would we go? He asked finally. I talked to my sister in Fort Wayne, Nancy replied. She says we could stay with them until we find a place. The economy's better there, more diversified, and Naomi could commute to Ball State from Fort Wayne if she needed to. Quinn closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the full import of what his wife was suggesting. Not just selling their home, but leaving South Bend entirely. Abandoning the city where both of them had been born, where they had met at a Studebaker Company picnic, where they had built their lives on the solid foundation of American manufacturing. "What about your parents?" he asked. Nancy's mother and father still lived in the same house where she had grown up, just 10 blocks away. "They understand," Nancy said softly. "Everyone understands, Quinn. We're not the only ones facing this choice." Indeed, the exodus from South Bend had accelerated in February. Each day brought news of another family leaving, another house standing empty, another small business closing its doors as its customer base eroded. The city was hemorrhaging people and with them its future. "I never thought," Quinn began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the sense of betrayal he felt, not just betrayal by Studebaker but by the entire system he had trusted. Work hard, stay loyal, build a good life. That had been the promise of post-war America, and Quinn had fulfilled his part of the bargain. Now, at 43, he was discovering that the covenant had been one-sided all along. "I know," Nancy said, squeezing his hand, "but we still have each other, we still have Naomi, we'll start over." Quinn nodded, though the thought of starting over in his 40s filled him with a dread he couldn't name. Who was he if not a Studebaker man in a Studebaker town? What was his value in a world that had discarded the skills he'd spent a lifetime perfecting? March arrived with the first tentative signs of spring, but there was little renewal in South Bend. The South Bend Tribune reported that unemployment in the city had reached 9.6%, more than double the national average. The Musil Brewing Company, a local institution since 1893, announced its closure, another 150 jobs lost. Robertson's department store reduced its hours further, operating now only from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., 5 days a week. Quinn continued his daily ritual of checking job boards, filling out applications, following up on leads that invariably led nowhere. His severance was dwindling fast, despite their careful budgeting. Nancy's alterations work had decreased as women across South Bend cut back on non-essential expenses. The financial pressure intensified daily. On a bright Saturday in mid-March, Quinn stood in their front yard, hammering a "For Sale BY Owner" sign into the still-frozen ground. Each strike of the hammer felt like a physical blow to his own body, to his identity, to his sense of place in the world, to the future he had imagined for his family. Across the street, Gil Harvey emerged from his house and crossed to where Quinn stood, hands thrust deep in the pockets of his jacket. "So you're going too," Gil said, not a question but a statement of fact. Quinn straightened, setting the hammer down. "Looking at Fort Wayne, Nancy's sister is there." Gil nodded, his gaze fixed on the sign Quinn had just planted. "We're thinking Michigan, Ann Arbor maybe. University towns seem to be doing better." They stood in silence for a moment, two neighbors who had known each other for years, both facing the dissolution of the community they had called home. "Did you ever think," Gil began, then shook his head. "No, I guess none of us did. We all thought Studebaker was forever. My dad used to say, buildings rise and fall, but Studebaker endures," Quinn recalled, looking down the street at the houses that had sheltered Studebaker families for generations. "Guess he was wrong about that." "The world's changing," Gil observed, his tone philosophical. "Manufacturing moving overseas, automation replacing workers, companies chasing the cheapest labor they can find." Quinn had been reading the same articles in the Tribune, analyses of the broader economic forces that had doomed Studebaker and threatened the entire American manufacturing sector. Cold comfort to the men who had believed their skills, their loyalty, their very identity as workers were valued. What happens to South Bend now? Quinn wondered aloud. What happens to all of this? He gestured to the neighborhood around them, the modest homes, the carefully maintained yards, the community built by and for working-class families. Gil shrugged. "Becomes something else, I guess, or fades away like those old mining towns out west, Ghost City." The comparison chilled Quinn. He'd seen photographs of those abandoned mining towns, empty streets, boarded-up buildings, communities that had flourished briefly and then vanished when the resource they depended on was exhausted. Could that be South Bend's fate, to slowly empty out, its population drifting away in search of work until only the shells of buildings remained? "I need to finish packing," Gil said finally, breaking the somber silence. "Linda wants the garage cleared out by tonight." Quinn watched his neighbor return to his house, where a half-filled moving truck already sat in the driveway. Another family leaving, another thread in the community fabric snapped. Inside, Quinn found Nancy and Naomi in the kitchen, sorting through cabinets, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind when they moved. "These were my mother's," Nancy was saying, carefully wrapping a set of china plates in newspaper. "And her mother's before that. They came over from Ireland in 1892. Naomi nodded, helping her mother wrap each plate. "We'll keep them for when I have my own place someday." The sight of them, his wife and daughter preparing for an upheaval he had failed to prevent, sent a wave of shame through Quinn. A man was supposed to provide stability, security, permanence. Instead, he was leading his family into an uncertain future, away from everything familiar, everything they had built together. "Signs up," he reported, hanging his jacket by the door. "Gil and Linda are leaving next week, Ann Arbor." Nancy looked up, her hands stilling on the plate she was wrapping. "Ann Arbor, that's nearly 3 hours away." "Everybody's scattering," Quinn said, the reality of it settling in his chest like a physical weight. "The Wilsons to Detroit. The Larsons to Dearborn, the Rodriguez family to Chicago, the Turners to Ontario." He sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. "What's left of South Bend when everyone's gone?" Nancy resumed her wrapping, her movements careful, precise. "Communities change, Quinn, they always have. My grandparents came here because there was work. Now we're leaving because the work is gone. That's the story of America, isn't it? People go where they can make a living." Her pragmatism, usually a source of strength, grated on Quinn in that moment. How could she reduce it to such simple terms? This wasn't just about work, about making a living. It was about belonging, about identity, about the covenant between a company and a city, a worker and a community. "It shouldn't have happened like this," he insisted, voice low but intense. "Not overnight, not without warning. Not after a century." Nancy set down the plate she was holding and came to stand beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "No, it shouldn't have, but it did, and now we adapt. That's what we've always done, isn't it?" "Adapted." Quinn placed his hand over hers, drawing comfort from the familiar warmth, the steadiness that had anchored him through 23 years of marriage. "I just thought," he began, then stopped. What had he thought exactly? That loyalty would be rewarded, that hard work guaranteed security, that the world he knew, the world of American manufacturing dominance, of company towns, of jobs for life, would continue unchanged. "I know," Nancy said softly, and Quinn realized she did know, without him having to articulate the sense of betrayal, of disorientation, of loss that went beyond mere employment. April brought the first serious interest in their house. A young couple with a baby on the way, the husband recently hired at Notre Dame University as a groundskeeper. The offer was 15% below what the house had been worth in November, before Studebaker's closure had flooded the market with similar properties, but it was enough to clear the mortgage with a small amount left over. "It's a good offer in this market," Nancy pointed out as they sat at the kitchen table, studying the paperwork, "and they can close in 30 days. Quinn nodded, staring at the number on the page. Years of mortgage payments, of home improvements, of building equity, all culminating in this figure that seemed impossibly small for the container of so many memories. "They seem like nice people," he conceded. The young couple had toured the house twice, asking thoughtful questions, admiring the improvements Quinn had made over the years. He said his father worked at Studebaker too, in the foundry. "Another Studebaker family," Nancy observed. "At least the house stays in the tradition." Quinn signed the acceptance, his signature a promise to surrender the home where he had expected to live out his days. Another piece of his identity chipped away. The remaining weeks in South Bend took on a dreamlike quality for Quinn, as if he were moving through a city that was already becoming a memory. Each familiar street, each neighborhood landmark, each routine errand now carried the weight of imminent departure. He visited his father's grave one last time, standing in the April sunshine as birds called from newly leafed trees. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said quietly. "We tried to stay, but there's nothing left for us here." The stone offered no answer, no absolution for the decision to leave. Quinn placed a small American flag, the kind his father had always insisted on displaying for patriotic holidays, against the headstone, a final gesture of respect for the man who had taught him what it meant to be a Studebaker worker, a provider, a man of South Bend. On his way home, Quinn drove past the Studebaker plant one last time. Building 2, where he had worked for over 2 decades, stood silent and empty, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. No smoke rose from the stacks. No workers streamed through its gates. The massive parking lot, once filled with the cars of 7,000 employees, now contained only windblown trash and sprouting weeds. Quinn pulled to the curb and sat in his car, staring at the abandoned factory. Soon, scrappers would come for the machinery inside, then developers perhaps to repurpose the buildings or tear them down entirely. Eventually, Studebaker would exist only in museums, in old photographs, in the memories of the men and women who had once been part of its vast industrial ecosystem. What would happen to those memories when the last Studebaker worker was gone? When the last person who remembered the sound of the whistle, the heat of the foundry, the pride of seeing a car roll off the line with your own handiwork inside it, had passed away? Quinn sat until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty factory grounds. Then he started his car, the Studebaker Lark he had helped build, and drove away for the final time. Moving day arrived with cruel efficiency. The Yates family had sold or given away much of their furniture, keeping only what would fit in their rented truck and the trunk of their car. Nancy's sister had offered them the finished basement of her Fort Wayne home until they could find an apartment of their own. A temporary arrangement that nonetheless felt to Quinn like a step backward, a regression from the independence they had earned through years of hard work. Naomi supervised the loading of her own possessions, clothes, books, the mementos of her childhood that could be transported to this new life. She had been accepted to Ball State after all, her excellent grades earning her a partial scholarship that, combined with what remained of her college fund and a part-time job, would allow her to attend in the fall. As Quinn carried the last box to the truck, he paused on the front porch looking back at the empty house. 23 years of marriage, 17 years of Naomi's life. Countless dinners, celebrations, arguments, reconciliations, moments of joy and sorrow, all contained within these walls. "Ready?" Nancy asked, joining him on the porch, the keys to their former home in her hand. Quinn nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "We'll leave these under the mat for the new owners," Nancy said, setting the keys on the porch swing. "They're coming by this afternoon to measure for curtains." Life continuing, new families moving in. New memories being created in the spaces where their own had been formed. Quinn followed his wife to their car, where Naomi was already waiting in the back seat. Through the windshield, he could see the "sold" sticker plastered across their "FOR sale" sign, a final, definitive marker of the transition from homeowners to what? Temporary residents in someone else's house, displaced workers seeking refuge with family. The identity shift was as jarring as the physical move. As Quinn pulled away from the curb, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the house receding behind them. In his mind, he saw not just the physical structure but the entire life it had represented. The security of Studebaker employment, the stability of a South Bend address, the certainty of knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged. All of it gone now. Not just for him, but for thousands of families like his, all navigating the same disorienting transition, all trying to make sense of a world where the covenant they had trusted had been abruptly, irrevocably broken. The drive to Fort Wayne took just over 2 hours, most of it passed in silence. Naomi eventually dozed off in the back seat, the emotional exhaustion of the day catching up with her. Nancy stared out the passenger window, her hand occasionally finding Quinn's across the seat, a wordless reassurance that whatever came next, they would face it together. As they approached Fort Wayne, following the directions Nancy's sister had provided, Quinn found himself studying the city with new eyes. The factories here, General Electric International Harvester, the Fort Wayne foundry, still operated, still employed thousands. The downtown streets still bustled with shoppers. The neighborhoods they passed through showed no signs of the abandonment that had begun to hollow out parts of South Bend. Would this become home? Could any place ever replace the city where he had been born, had worked, had expected to die? Nancy's sister's house sat on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood of modest but well-maintained homes, not unlike sunny Med Avenue. Quinn thought with a pang of homesickness that surprised him with its intensity. They had only been gone from South Bend for hours, and already he felt the ache of displacement. As Quinn parked behind his sister-in-law's station wagon, he saw the front door open, Nancy's sister emerging with a welcoming smile. Behind her, her husband, a manager at the General Electric plant, waved from the doorway. "You made it," Nancy's sister called, hurrying down the front walk to embrace first Nancy, then Naomi, then Quinn himself. "We've got everything ready for you. Tom's grilling steaks for dinner to celebrate your arrival." Her enthusiasm, her obvious pleasure at having them there, touched Quinn even as it underscored the charity they were now dependent upon. He forced a smile, shaking his brother-in-law's hand when the man approached to help with the unloading. "Heard from a buddy at work that GE might be hiring soon," Tom offered as they carried boxes toward the house. "Production's up, government contracts are solid. I could put in a word for you." Quinn nodded, grateful for the offer yet aware of the gulf it represented. From Studebaker man, from homeowner, community member, equal to recipient of favors, of connections, of assistance. "I'd appreciate that," he said, meaning it despite the complicated emotions churning beneath the words. Inside, Nancy's sister showed them to the basement where they would be staying, a finished space with a bedroom area, a sitting area, a small bathroom. Clean, comfortable, temporary, nothing like the home they had left behind. As Quinn set down the boxes he was carrying, he caught sight of himself in a mirror hanging on the wall, a middle-aged man with graying temples and tired eyes, standing in a borrowed space, surrounded by the reduced belongings of a life that no longer existed. Who was he now? Not a Studebaker man, that identity had vanished with the company itself. Not a South Bend resident, that connection had been severed with their departure. Not even a homeowner anymore, that status had been surrendered with the keys left under the mat on sunny Med Avenue. The question lingered as they unpacked, as they joined Nancy's sister and brother-in-law for dinner, as they navigated the awkward dynamics of 4 adults and a teenager suddenly sharing a space designed for 2. Who was Quinn Yates without Studebaker, without South Bend, without the identity that had defined him for most of his adult life? The next morning, Quinn rose early, a habit ingrained by decades of factory shifts that his body refused to abandon despite the absence of work to go to. He made coffee in his sister-in-law's kitchen, careful to be quiet, then carried his mug out to the back porch to watch the dawn break over this unfamiliar city. 2 houses down, a man emerged from his home, lunch box in hand, and walked to a car in the driveway. Quinn watched him drive away to a factory, to an office, to the structured certainty of employment that Quinn himself no longer possessed. The scene repeated up and down the street as Fort Wayne stirred to life. Men in work clothes heading to early shifts, women in office attire departing for administrative jobs. The daily rhythm of a working city, a rhythm Quinn was now excluded from. Nancy joined him on the porch, her own coffee mug in hand, and sat in the chair beside him. "What do we do now?" Quinn asked quietly, watching another worker depart for his job. Nancy sipped her coffee before answering. "Today, we look for an apartment, something we can afford on savings until you find work. Something close to Ball State so Naomi can commute if she needs to." Practical steps, concrete actions, Nancy's approach to every challenge. "And then," Quinn pressed. Nancy reached over and took his hand. "Then we rebuild, Quinn. Just like we always have when things got hard, one day at a time." Quinn squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her certainty, her steady faith in their ability to adapt. She was right, of course. They would rebuild, they would adapt. They would create a new life in this new city. But as Quinn watched the last of the morning's workers drive away, he found himself mourning not just the job he had lost, but the entire world that had vanished with it. The world of Studebaker South Bend, where a man knew exactly who he was and where he belonged, where loyalty was rewarded and hard work guaranteed security, where a company and a city stood together in what had seemed an unbreakable covenant. That world was gone, as thoroughly and permanently as if it had never existed. And in its place stood this uncertain future, This new reality where corporations owed nothing to the communities they abandoned, where decades of service could be erased overnight, where men like Quinn Yates were left to reinvent themselves in middle age, untethered from the identities that had defined them. "We'll be okay," Nancy assured him, mistaking his silence for doubt. Quinn nodded, forcing a smile for his wife's benefit. "I know we will." And perhaps they would be. Perhaps in time, Quinn would find work in Fort Wayne. Perhaps they would rent an apartment, then eventually buy another home. Perhaps Naomi would graduate from Ball State and build a career in this new economy. Perhaps Quinn himself would discover who he was beyond the identity Studebaker had provided him. But South Bend, the South Bend of his youth, of his father's life, of Studebaker's century-long dominance, that South Bend was gone forever, existing now only in memory, in photographs, in the stories that would someday sound like ancient history to generations who would never understand what it meant to be a Studebaker man in a Studebaker town. As the sun rose fully over Fort Wayne, Quinn Yates faced the first day of whatever came next. 15 years later, 1978. Quinn Yates guided his Ford Fairmont off the interstate exit for South Bend, his hands light on the wheel of the unfamiliar rental car. Beside him, Nancy adjusted her reading glasses and consulted the map spread across her lap. "Looks like we stay on this road until we hit downtown," she said, "then turn right on Michigan Street." Quinn nodded, his attention split between the road ahead and the landscape around them. 15 years had passed since they'd left South Bend, yet some part of him had expected the city to remain frozen in time, preserved exactly as they had left it. Instead, the South Bend that greeted them was both familiar and foreign, the geography unchanged but the details altered, as if someone had rearranged the furniture in a once familiar room. "The farmer's market is still there," Nancy observed as they passed the large building where they had once bought fresh produce every Saturday morning. "Looks like they've expanded." "Hospital's bigger too," Quinn noted, spotting the new wing added to Memorial Hospital, where Vic Donohue had died on the day Studebaker announced its closure. They were in South Bend for Naomi's 10-year college reunion at Notre Dame, where she had earned her master's degree after completing her undergraduate work at Ball State. Their daughter had gone from journalism to law school, now practiced corporate law in Chicago, a career path unimaginable in the South Bend they had left behind. "Should we drive by the old neighborhood first?" Nancy asked. "Or head straight downtown?" Quinn considered the question. They had a few hours before they needed to meet Naomi and her husband at the hotel. "The neighborhood," he decided. "I want to see if our house is still there." Nancy reached across the seat to touch his hand briefly, understanding the emotion behind the request. The house on Sunnymead Avenue represented more than just a former residence, it was the physical embodiment of the life they had lost when Studebaker closed. As they turned onto the once familiar street, Quinn slowed the car, studying each house they passed. Some were exactly as he remembered, others had been remodeled, repainted, expanded. A few had clearly fallen into disrepair, victims of South Bend's continued economic struggles. "There it is," Nancy said softly as they approached the house they had called home for 13 years. Quinn pulled to the curb and parked, his eyes fixed on the two-story structure. The new owners, or perhaps subsequent owners, had painted it a different color, had replaced the front porch railings, had removed the maple tree that once stood in the front yard. But it was undeniably their former home, the place where they had raised their daughter, where they had expected to spend their retirement years. "Looks like they're taking good care of it," Nancy observed, her tone deliberately light. Quinn nodded, unable to speak past the unexpected lump in his throat. Seeing the house again brought back not just memories of their life there, but the acute sense of displacement he had felt upon leaving, the disorienting realization that everything he had believed permanent could vanish overnight. "Do you want to knock?" Nancy asked. "See if they'll let us look around." Quinn shook his head. "No, it's not our house anymore." He started the car again, pulling away from the curb with a last glance in the rearview mirror. "Let's go downtown." The changes were more dramatic in South Bend's center. Some blocks had been revitalized, with new businesses occupying storefronts that had stood empty when they left. Other areas had deteriorated further, buildings boarded up, sidewalks cracked and buckling. Quinn drove slowly down Michigan Street, past the former location of Robertson's department store, now subdivided into smaller shops, past the South Bend Tribune building, past the bank where they had once negotiated their mortgage extension in the desperate days after Studebaker's closure. Newman and Altman is gone, Nancy noted as they passed the former location of South Bend's premier Studebaker dealership. A discount furniture store now occupied the space where gleaming new cars had once been displayed. Quinn wasn't surprised. With no new Studebakers being produced after 1966, the dealerships had been forced to switch brands or close. Newman and Altman had apparently chosen the latter. They turned onto Sample Street, following the route that had once led to the Studebaker factory complex. Quinn wasn't sure what he expected to find: the buildings demolished, perhaps, or converted to other uses. What he hadn't anticipated was the vast emptiness that greeted them. Where the massive Plant 2 had once stood, the building where Quinn had spent most of his working life, there was now only an empty field, with concrete foundations still visible in places, weeds growing through cracks in the remaining pavement. Of the industrial cathedral that had once housed 7,000 workers, nothing remained except these ghostly outlines. Quinn pulled the car to the side of the road and cut the engine, staring at the vacant space that had once been the center of his world. "They tore it down," he said unnecessarily, his voice barely above a whisper. Nancy nodded. "I read about it in one of Naomi's letters, 1973, I think. The city couldn't find a buyer for the buildings." Quinn opened his car door and stepped out, drawn to the empty site by a force he couldn't articulate. Nancy followed, taking his hand as they walked to the chain-link fence that surrounded the former factory grounds. Through the fence, Quinn could see remnants of the railroad tracks that had once carried finished Studebakers to markets across the country. A few concrete pillars still stood, marking where loading docks had been. Otherwise, there was only emptiness where the heartbeat of South Bend had once pulsed. "Hard to believe it's all gone," Quinn said, his fingers curling around the chain link, like it never existed. But it had existed. In this very spot, Quinn had spent 22 years of his life. He had installed dashboards on thousands of cars. He had formed friendships with men like Vic Donohue and Len Turner. He had been part of something larger than himself, a vast industrial enterprise that had shaped not just his life but the entire identity of South Bend. "Remember how loud it was?" he asked Nancy, his eyes still fixed on the empty space. "You could hear the press shop from blocks away when the windows were open in summer." Nancy squeezed his hand, and the whistle. "You could set your clock by it anywhere in the city." They stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own memories of the world that had once existed here. Finally, Nancy checked her watch. "We should head to the hotel," she said gently. "Naomi and Robert will be waiting." Quinn nodded, reluctantly turning away from the fence. As they walked back to the car, he found himself thinking not about what had been lost, but what had been gained in the 15 years since Studebaker's closure. After 6 months in Nancy's sister's basement, they had found an apartment in Fort Wayne. Through Tom's connection, Quinn had secured a job at General Electric, not on the assembly line but in the warehouse, managing inventory. The pay had been less than Studebaker, the work less satisfying, but it had been employment. 3 years later, when a position opened in quality control, Quinn had applied and been promoted. By 1970, he had become a shift supervisor, earning nearly what he had at Studebaker. They had purchased a small house in Fort Wayne, had sent Naomi to college, had rebuilt their lives piece by piece. It hadn't been the future Quinn had envisioned when he started at Studebaker at age 21. It hadn't been the continuation of his father's legacy, the fulfillment of the covenant he had believed in. But it had been a life sometimes difficult, sometimes rewarding, always moving forward. "What are you thinking about?" Nancy asked as they reached the car. Quinn looked back at the empty field where Studebaker had stood. "About how wrong I was," he said. "Back in '63 when the plant closed, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never be anything but a Studebaker man." Nancy smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes crinkling. "And now?" "Now I know better," Quinn said, opening the car door for his wife. "I know that a job isn't who you are. A company isn't your identity. Those things can disappear overnight, but you're still yourself." They drove to the hotel in a comfortable silence, each processing the emotional impact of revisiting their former home. As they approached downtown again, Quinn noticed a small museum he didn't remember from their time in South Bend. The Studebaker National Museum, Nancy read from the sign as they passed, opened 1974. We should take Naomi and Robert there tomorrow. Quinn nodded, oddly moved by the thought that Studebaker had been preserved, at least in this form, not as a living, breathing industrial giant but as an artifact of history, a reminder of what South Bend had once been and what it had lost. In the hotel lobby, Quinn spotted their daughter immediately. At 32, Naomi Yates Thompson had her mother's practical nature and her father's steady determination. She waved when she saw them, then hugged each of them in turn before introducing her husband, who shook Quinn's hand with the firm grip of a man raised to respect his elders. "How was the drive from Fort Wayne?" Naomi asked as they settled in the lobby's sitting area. "Fine," Nancy replied. "We took a detour to see the old house and the factory site." Naomi's expression softened with understanding. "I almost drove by there yesterday, but I wasn't sure I wanted to see it empty." "It's strange," Quinn admitted, "like visiting a grave." Robert, who had never known South Bend in its Studebaker days, looked slightly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Naomi says South Bend is making a comeback. The university is expanding, and there's talk of new technology companies moving in." Quinn nodded, acknowledging the attempt to shift to more positive territory. "We saw some new businesses downtown, and the farmers' market looks to be doing well." "The city's reinventing itself," Naomi said, "not as a manufacturing center but as something new. Something different." Just as Quinn himself had been forced to do after Studebaker's closure. The parallel wasn't lost on him, nor was the irony. He had spent years lamenting the loss of South Bend's industrial identity, yet had successfully forged a new identity of his own. "That's what you do when the world changes out from under you," he said. "You adapt, you move forward." Naomi smiled, reaching out to squeeze her father's hand. "That's what you taught me, Dad. When everything fell apart after Studebaker, you showed me that you can lose a job, lose a house, lose a hometown, and still keep going." Quinn hadn't thought of it that way. In his own mind, he had failed to maintain the stability that was a man's primary responsibility, had failed to preserve his father's legacy, had failed to fulfill the covenant he had believed in. But through his daughter's eyes he saw a different story, one of resilience, of adaptation, of continuing to provide and protect even when the ground shifted beneath his feet. "We did what we had to do," he said simply. "You did more than that," Naomi insisted. "You rebuilt your life from scratch in your 40s. Do you know how many of your former coworkers never recovered, how many just gave up?" Quinn did know. He had kept in touch with a few Studebaker men over the years. Some, like Len Turner, had found new careers and thrived. Others had drifted from job to job, never regaining the security or status they had enjoyed at Studebaker. A few, like Vic Donohue, hadn't survived the initial shock. "We were luckier than most," Quinn acknowledged. "We had family in Fort Wayne, I had skills that transferred, not everyone did." "It wasn't just luck," Nancy interjected gently, "it was choice. You chose to start over instead of giving up. You chose to redefine yourself instead of clinging to what was lost." Quinn had never viewed it as a choice. At the time, it had felt like the only path forward, one foot in front of the other, day after day, rebuilding from the ruins of what had been taken from them. But perhaps that was the choice, to move forward at all when standing still in grief and anger might have been easier. As they continued their conversation, making plans for the reunion events Naomi would attend the next day, Quinn found himself reflecting on the city around them, the South Bend that was, the South Bend that had been lost, and the South Bend that was now emerging. Like himself, the city had been forced to construct a new identity after Studebaker's departure. The process had been painful, had taken years, had left scars still visible in abandoned buildings and empty lots. But South Bend had survived, had adapted, had begun to envision a future different from but not necessarily lesser than its past. Later that evening, after dinner at a restaurant that hadn't existed in their time, Quinn and Nancy walked along the St. Joseph River, following a newly constructed riverwalk that offered views of the water and the city skyline. "It's not the same city," Nancy observed, her arm linked through Quinn's, "but it's still South Bend." Quinn nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The essence of the place remained, even as its external features changed. just as he was still Quinn Yates, still a husband, still a father, still a provider, even without the Studebaker identity that had once defined him. "Do you ever regret leaving?" he asked, a question that had lingered unspoken between them for 15 years. Nancy considered this, her pace slowing. "Sometimes I miss what we had here, the house, the neighborhood, the certainty." She looked up at him, her face softened by the evening light. "But I've never regretted going forward with you, wherever that led." Quinn squeezed her hand, overwhelmed by gratitude for this woman who had weathered every storm beside him, who had dismantled her life and rebuilt it without complaint when Studebaker's closure forced them to leave everything they had known. "I used to think Studebaker's closing was the worst thing that ever happened to us," Quinn admitted. "Now I'm not so sure." Nancy raised an eyebrow. "Oh. It shattered everything I believed about work, about security, about what makes a man valuable," Quinn explained. "And that was painful, but it also forced me to see that I was more than my job, that my worth wasn't tied to a company that could disappear overnight." They continued walking, passing young couples, students from Notre Dame, families enjoying the spring evening, the diverse population of the new South Bend, a city no longer defined by a single industry, a single employer, a single identity. "If Studebaker hadn't closed, we'd still be here," Quinn continued. "I'd have retired from the same job I started at 21, never knowing I could be anything else. Never testing what I was really made of." Nancy nodded, understanding, and Naomi might never have gone to law school, might never have moved to Chicago, might never have met Robert. The lives they might have led in a South Bend where Studebaker endured would have been more secure, perhaps more stable. But also smaller, more limited, defined by boundaries they hadn't known existed until those boundaries were forcibly removed. "We lost a lot when Studebaker closed," Quinn concluded, watching the sunset reflect off the river, "but maybe we found something too." What they had found was impossible to name precisely. A resilience, a capacity for reinvention, a broader understanding of what constituted identity and worth in a changing world. Painful lessons acquired at great cost, but valuable nonetheless. As darkness fell over South Bend, Quinn and Nancy turned back toward their hotel, leaving the river and the reflections it had inspired. Tomorrow they would visit the Studebaker Museum with Naomi and Robert, would view the artifacts of the company that had shaped their early lives, would see Studebaker transformed from living enterprise to historical exhibit. And then they would return to Fort Wayne, to the life they had built after Studebaker, to the identity they had forged not from industrial certainty but from the harder materials of adaptation and resilience. South Bend without Studebaker, Quinn Yates without Studebaker, both had seemed impossible once, both had become reality, both had survived. As they reached their hotel, Quinn took one last look at the city skyline, at the buildings that remained from his youth, at the new structures that had risen since, at the empty spaces where Studebaker had once stood. The company was gone, the covenant broken, the certainties shattered, but South Bend endured, different but persistent. And so did Quinn Yates, no longer defined by where he worked or what he built, but by his capacity to begin again, to adapt, to continue. In that perhaps lay the most valuable legacy of all.